Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Before we dive into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're listening from. She collapsed at his doorstep, Goose carried by the storm, whispering that she was filthy inside and out. But when the tough cowboy pulled back the veil, what he found was not the dirt of the road, but a mark of pure evil, a brand that tied her to the most dangerous man in the territory. This is a story about a woman reclaiming her soul, and a cowboy willing to burn down the whole world to help her do it. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Storm. The rain came to the high desert of Arizona like a judgment. It wasn't the soft, life-giving rain of greener lands, but a hard, violent deluge that fell from a bruised purple sky, turning the dust to a thick, grasping mud and the dry roads into raging, brown torrents. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the stoic cigarros and shrieking around the corners of the small, solitary ranch house that stood as a lonely testament to one man's stubborn refusal to be broken by the land. Inside that house, Jedediah Jed Stone sat at his rough-hewn table, the golden light of a kerosene lamp pushing back the encroaching twilight. The rhythmic sound of him mauling his cold peacemaker was the only counterpoint to the storm's fury. It was a familiar, comforting ritual, the feel of the cool, heavy steel in his calloused hands, a connection to the only law he truly trusted. Jed was a man made of the same unyielding material as the land he worked. His face was a roadmap of sun and sorrow, the lines around his eyes and mouth carved deep by loss and the unrelenting glare of the Arizona sky. His eyes, the color of faded denim, had a look of distant horizons, as if they were always seeing something that was no longer there. They were the eyes of a man who had buried his heart in the same rocky soil where he had buried his wife and infant daughter 5 years prior, taken by a fever that had swept through the valley like a phantom thief. Since then, his world had shrunk to the boundaries of his ranch, his companions, the cattle he raised, the horse he rode, and the ghosts he kept. The storm was a fitting match for the one that lived permanently inside him. He welcomed it. It was loud and honest, its violence a clean, pure thing compared to the quiet, insidious violence of disease. He was just finishing his work on the colt when a sound, nearly lost in the roar of the wind, made him freeze. It was a frantic, desperate pounding on his front door. Jed's hand closed around the grip of his revolver, his thumb resting on the hammer. Visitors were rarer than a cool day in July, and no sane person would be out in a storm like this. His mind catalogued the possibilities: a lost traveler, an injured rider, or, more likely, trouble. In this part of the country, trouble often came on horseback and knocked on your door in the middle of a storm. He moved to the door, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. He peered through the small peephole he had drilled into the thick oak. All he could see was a shifting, shapeless mass of wet fabric, a dark bundle slumped against the doorframe. With his colt held ready at his side, he slid the heavy bolt back and opened the door a crack. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it open against the inside wall. Rain and wind exploded into the room, sending papers flying and making the lamp flame gutter wildly. And in that chaotic moment, the bundle on his porch pitched forward and fell into the room, landing in a heap on his floor. It was a person, so enveloped in a heavy, dark, oilskin cloak that it was impossible to tell if it was a man or a woman. They lay there, face down in a growing puddle of rainwater, not moving. Jed's first instinct was suspicion, a deeply ingrained habit of a man who had learned that the world was not a kind place. But his second, older instinct, the bedrock of decency that even his grief had not been able to erode, took over. He holstered his colt, shut the door against the raging storm, and knelt beside the figure. He gently turned them over. It was a woman. Her face was pale as death, streaked with mud and rain, her lips a faint, bluish gray. Her hair, a mass of tangled, dark curls, was plastered to her skin. She was young, younger than he had expected, and she looked as if she had been run to the very end of her endurance, and then a good 10 miles further. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. With a grunt, he lifted her. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of wet rags and fragile bones. He carried her to the hearth, where the embers of his morning fire still glowed, and laid her down on the bearskin rug he kept there. He threw a few fresh logs onto the embers, and they quickly caught, the flames beginning to push back the bone-deep chill that radiated from her. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency, his movements stripped of any softness but filled with a rough, practical care. He removed the heavy, soaked cloak. Beneath it, she wore a simple, worn-out dress that was little more than rags, torn and muddy. Her feet were bare, the soles cut and bleeding. A fresh wave of pity, an emotion he had thought long dead in him, stirred in his chest. Whatever she was running from, it must have been a pure terror to drive her barefoot through a storm in the high desert. He fetched a blanket, a rough woolen thing, and wrapped her in it. He boiled water for coffee, lacing it with a generous splash of whiskey, and when she began to stir, her eyelids fluttering, he gently lifted her head and helped her drink the hot, potent liquid. She coughed, sputtering, but the warmth and the whiskey seemed to rekindle a tiny spark of life in her. Her eyes opened, and he found himself looking into the largest, darkest, most terrified eyes he had ever seen. They were the eyes of a cornered doe, a creature that expects nothing but pain and death. "You're safe," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing, rusty from disuse. "You're at the Stone Ranch. The storm, it'll pass." She stared at him, her eyes darting around the room, taking in the solid walls, the fire, the man who knelt beside her. Her body was cold with a tension so profound it seemed to be the only thing holding her together. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice a dry, scratchy thing, the sound of dead leaves skittering across a stone. "Jedediah Stone," he replied. "Now, just rest. You need to get your strength back." He tried to offer her some stew he had warming by the fire, but she shook her head, her eyes wide with something that looked like revulsion. He brought her a clean, dry shirt of his own, thinking to get her out of her wet rags, but when he tried to help her, she flinched away from his touch with a small, sharp cry. Scrambling backwards until her back was against the stone of the hearth, her arms wrapped around herself, a shield against him. "All right," he said, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "All right. I won't touch you." He left the shirt on the floor beside her. "It's there if you want it." He retreated to his table, giving her the entire space by the fire, and went back to the familiar, grounding ritual of cleaning his guns, his presence a quiet, watchful, and, he hoped, non-threatening constant. She stayed huddled by the fire for what must have been an hour, wrapped in the blanket, her body trembling, sometimes from the cold, sometimes, he suspected, from a fear that had nothing to do with the storm outside. She drank the rest of the coffee, and eventually, the color began to return to her cheeks. Finally, she spoke, her voice still a whisper, but stronger now. "Thank you," he grunted in acknowledgement, not looking up from his work. Words were currency he rarely dealt in. I should go," she said, making a weak, futile gesture of trying to stand. "Don't be a fool," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "You'll die out there. The storm won't let up till morning. You'll stay here for the night. You can have my bed. I'll take the floor." She stared at him, a new, more complex fear entering her eyes. The idea of sleeping in his bed, in this house, seemed to terrify her more than the storm. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, I can't. I can't sleep in a clean bed. I can't put on clean clothes." Jed finally put down his cleaning rag and looked at her, a frown creasing his weathered brow. He didn't understand. She was filthy, exhausted, and freezing. His offer was one of simple, basic human decency. Her reaction was unnatural. "Why not?" he asked, his voice laced with a gruff impatience. Her face, which had been pale with exhaustion, now seemed to crumble, her features contorting in a mask of a profound, soul-deep agony and a shame so powerful it was a physical presence in the room. Tears began to stream down her face, silent, heartbreaking tracks through the grime. "Because I'm dirty," she cried, the words torn from her in a raw, ragged sob. "I'm dirty, inside and out." The words hung in the air between them, a confession of a sin so deep he couldn't begin to comprehend it. He thought she meant the mud, the grime of the road. But the look in her eyes, the sheer self-loathing that radiated from her, told him it was something far deeper, a stain on her very soul. "I can't," she sobbed, her body shaking with the force of her grief. "I can't soil your things. I'm unclean." Jed was a simple man. He understood the clean lines of survival, of honor, of a hard day's work. He did not understand this kind of self-hatred, this deep, spiritual filth she seemed to be drowning in. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice softer now, his gruffness replaced by a genuine, bewildered confusion. She didn't answer with words. She clutched the rough woolen blanket to her chest, her knuckles white. Her dark, tear-filled eyes looked at the heavy, oilskin cloak that lay in a heap on the floor where he had left it. It was more than a piece of clothing, it was her shield, her hiding place. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice thick with shame. "What I am, what was done to me, it's marked me, forever." She pointed a trembling finger at the cloak. "Under there," she said, her voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. "The cover you'll see." Jed looked from her tormented face to the dark, heavy cloak. A sense of dread, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the back of his neck. This was more than a woman running from a bad situation. This was something darker, something twisted. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, with a terrible, unknown darkness swirling in the canyon below. He rose from his chair and walked slowly towards the cloak. He knelt, his knees protesting, and picked it up. It was heavy, stiff with dried mud and rainwater. It was just a cloak. "What am I supposed to be seeing?" he asked, his voice gentle. She didn't answer. She only huddled deeper into the blanket, her sobs now quiet, hopeless whimpers. He looked at the cloak again, turning it over in his hands. And then he saw it. Sewn into the inner lining, right between the shoulder blades, was a patch of fine, embroidered silk, a stark contrast to the rough, practical fabric of the cloak. The embroidery was intricate, beautifully done. It was a single, stylized letter K, intertwined with a serpent. It was a crest, a sigil, a mark of a powerful and wealthy man. But it was the thread that made his blood run cold. It was woven with threads of pure, shining gold. This was no ordinary cloak. This was a uniform, a livery, the mark of ownership. He looked back at the woman, and a dawning, sickening understanding began to form in his mind. The cover she was talking about wasn't the cloak. Slowly, he rose and walked to her. He knelt in front of her, his face grim. "Let me see," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. She flinched, shaking her head, her eyes squeezed shut, as if his words were a physical blow. "No, please, you'll hate me. You'll cast me out. Everyone does." "I'm not everyone," he said, his voice softer, but with an edge of steel. "I'm not casting you out, but I need to understand. Let me see." For a long, agonizing moment, she was still. Then, with a shuddering, resigned sigh that seemed to carry the weight of her entire, tragic life, she turned her back to him. Her hands, trembling violently, reached for the top of the blanket. She hesitated, and then, with a final, choked sob, she let it fall from her shoulders. Jedediah Stone, a man who had seen death, who had faced down rustlers and charging bulls, who had buried his own family, stared. And a horror colder and sharper than any he had ever known washed over him, leaving him breathless, his heart a frozen lump of ice in his chest. The flickering firelight danced on the pale skin of her back, illuminating the source of her shame, the reason for her soul-deep cry of unclean. It was not a scar. It was not a tattoo. It was a brand, burned deep into the flesh of her right shoulder blade, a puckered, angry, and permanent mark of ownership, was the exact same sigil from the cloak. A stylized letter K, intertwined with a serpent. It was a cattle brand, a mark of property, seared onto human flesh. The horror of it was not just in the act itself, but in its cruel, artistic precision. This was not the work of a crude, angry man with a hot iron. This was the work of a monster, a man who had taken the time to have a special, intricate brand forged, a man who saw other human beings as nothing more than prized livestock, to be marked and owned. The brand was the source of her shame, the physical manifestation of the dirt she felt within her soul. And as Jed stared at that terrible, inhuman mark, a rage, cold and pure and murderous, began to build in the depths of his being, a rage directed at the unknown beast who had held the iron. A rage that would change the course of both their lives forever. Chapter 2, The Brand of Cain. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft, shuddering sobs of the woman who knelt before it. The firelight played across the grotesque mark on her back, making the scarred flesh seem to twist and writhe, a living testament to an unspeakable cruelty. Jed remained frozen, kneeling behind her, the image of the brand burned into his mind's eye. It was the intimacy of the evil that horrified him most. He'd seen men shot, stabbed, and hanged. He understood the brutal, often swift, violence of the frontier. But this was different. This was a slow, deliberate act of defilement, an act of ownership that was meant to last a lifetime. It was a calculated effort to strip a person of their very humanity, to reduce them to the level of an animal, a thing. The serpent intertwined with the K seemed to mock him, a symbol of a poison that had seeped deep into this woman's soul. His first impulse was a wave of pure, unadulterated fury. He wanted to find the man who had done this, the man who answered to the initial K, and he wanted to visit upon him a pain 1,000 times worse than the one he had inflicted. He wanted to feel the man's bones break in his hands, to see the light of his miserable life extinguished. The rage was so potent, so overwhelming, it was a physical taste in his mouth, metallic and bitter. But his second impulse, which followed a half-second behind the first, was a surge of profound, aching compassion for the woman who bore the mark. He looked at her trembling shoulders, at the vulnerable line of her neck, and he understood. He understood her flinching from his touch, her refusal of a clean bed, her cry of being dirty. Inside and out, she did not see the brand as a sign of her tormentor's evil. She saw it as a sign of her own worthlessness. She had internalized the monster's message. She believed she was no better than the cattle he branded. In that moment, a profound shift occurred within him. The solitary, grief-stricken rancher, the man who had closed his heart to the world, felt the ice that had encased it for 5 long years begin to crack. The woman before him was not a problem to be solved, not a stranger to be sheltered for a night. She was a victim of an evil so profound that it demanded a response. And he, Jedediah Stone, a man who lived by a simple, unwritten code of honor, knew that he had been chosen, by fate or by the storm, to be that response. His rage cooled, not disappearing, but solidifying, transforming from a wild, consuming fire into a block of cold, hard steel in his gut. This was his purpose now. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out. His hand, large and calloused from years of working rope and leather, was surprisingly gentle as he did the one thing she would never have expected. He did not touch the brand. He gently, reverently, pulled the woolen blanket back up and over her shoulders, covering the terrible mark, shielding her from his own gaze, giving her back the privacy of her pain. She flinched at his touch, a sharp, violent tremor, and tensed, as if expecting a blow. But when all she felt was the soft warmth of the blanket, a choked, confused sound escaped her. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "And I ain't casting you out." He rose and went to the hearth, adding more wood to the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. He was giving her time, giving her space. He understood that he was dealing with a creature that was half wild with trauma. Any sudden move, any wrong word, would send her bolting back into the darkness. "That mark," he said, his back to her, his voice carefully neutral as he stared into the flames. "It don't make you dirty. It makes the man who did it a monster. There's a difference." His words, simple and direct, were a lifeline thrown into the sea of her shame. She had expected disgust, revulsion, perhaps a cruel, pitying curiosity. She had not expected this quiet, immediate validation. She had not expected him to place the blame, the dirt, squarely where it belonged, on the perpetrator, not the victim. She slowly turned to look at him, her tear-streaked face a mixture of disbelief and a fragile, burgeoning hope. He was still not looking at her, his rugged profile etched in shadow and firelight. "What's your name?" he asked, still not looking at her. "Lily," she whispered, the name feeling foreign on her own tongue. It was a name from another life, a life before the brand. "Lily," he repeated, tasting the name. "Well, Lily, you're safe here, for as long as you need to be. No one's gonna find you, and no one's gonna hurt you. That's my word." A cowboy's word, in this part of the country, was a sacred thing, a bond stronger than any written contract. And she, a woman who had known nothing but lies and broken promises, heard the ring of absolute truth in his voice. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small, warm cabin, the storm inside Lily had begun, for the first time, to quiet. She didn't know who this grim, quiet man was, or why he was offering her this sanctuary. But in a world that had shown her only cruelty, he had offered her an unconditional and questioning kindness. And for a woman who was drowning, it was a piece of solid ground. The night passed in a strange, silent truce. She refused the bed, curling up on the bearskin rug by the fire, the woolen blanket pulled tight around her. He took a second blanket and settled into his armchair, the shotgun leaning against the wall beside him. He did not sleep. He kept watch, a silent, solitary guardian, his gaze alternating between the dark, rain-lashed windows and the small, wounded woman who slept fitfully by his hearth. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and smelling of rain and wet sage. Lily awoke, stiff and sore, to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Jed was at the stove, his back to her. He had already been out. His boots were muddy, and a bucket of fresh, steaming milk sat on the table. "There's coffee," he said, without turning. "And food. You should eat." She ate, for the first time in what felt like days, a hunger she hadn't even realized was there suddenly ravenous. The food was simple bacon, eggs, and thick, sourdough bread, but it was the most delicious meal she had ever tasted. It was a taste of normalcy, of safety. The days that followed fell into a quiet, tentative routine. Jed was true to his word. He never asked her about her past, about the brand, about the man with the initial K. He seemed to understand that her story was a wounded thing, and to probe at it would be to cause more pain. He simply created a space for her to exist, to heal. He would go about his daily chores, mending fences, tending to the cattle, and she would watch him from the safety of the porch. He was a man of immense physical strength and quiet competence. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life of hard, ceaseless work. She, in turn, began to make herself useful around the house. She was a phantom at first, cleaning and tidying when he was out, so that he would return to a house that was a little cleaner, a little more orderly, than when he had left it. She found a sewing kit, the property of a ghost she was beginning to understand had once inhabited this house, and she began to mend his worn-out clothes. Her stitches so small and neat they were almost invisible. It was a silent, delicate negotiation of space and trust. He would leave a bucket of fresh milk on the porch for her, a silent offering. She would leave a freshly baked loaf of bread cooling on the table for him, a silent thank you. They rarely spoke, but they were in constant communication. But the trauma she carried was not so easily quieted. The nights were the worst. She would be ripped from sleep by nightmares, her own stifled screams echoing in the silent house. She would dream of a place that was all silk and perfume and gilded cages, a place where a man with cold, dead eyes would smile at her while he polished the beautiful, serpentine branding iron. One night, the dream was particularly vivid. She awoke with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright, her body drenched in a cold sweat, the smell of burning flesh thick in her nostrils. Her door creaked open, and Jed stood there, a silhouette in the moonlight, the shotgun held loosely in his hand. He had heard her cry. "You all right?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She couldn't speak, only shake her head, her body racked with tremors. He didn't come into the room. He seemed to understand that would be a violation of her space. He just stood there, a solid, reassuring presence in the doorway. "It was just a dream," he said. "You're safe here, Lily. He can't get to you here." The simple, powerful certainty in his voice was a balm to her terrified soul. He stood there for a long time, until her trembling subsided and her breathing returned to normal. He was her sentinel, her guardian against the demons of the night. The next day, he made a decision. He found her sitting on the porch, her hands idle in her lap, her eyes staring, and seeing, at the distant mountains. "Come with me," he said, not as a request, but as a gentle command. He took her to the corral. Inside was a beautiful, intelligent-looking mare with a coat the color of honey. "This is Daisy," he said. "She was my wife's horse. She's gentle, but she's got spirit. I think it's time someone rode her again." Lily stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a long-dormant excitement. "I don't know how to ride. I'll teach you," he said simply. And so, he did. The riding lessons became a new ritual, a new language between them. At first, she was terrified, her body stiff, her hands clutching the saddle horn. But Jed was a patient, methodical teacher. His hands would gently guide hers on the reins, his voice a low, calm murmur as he taught her the commands. His touch was always impersonal, always respectful, but it was a touch nonetheless, and she slowly, began to learn that a man's touch did not have to mean pain. She was a natural. The fear gave way to a thrilling sense of freedom. To be on the horse, to feel its powerful muscles moving beneath her. To race across the open plains with the wind in her hair, it was an intoxicating taste of a power and an autonomy she had never known. For the first time in her life, she was not being led or dragged or caged. She was in control. One afternoon, they had ridden further than ever before, to a high mesa that overlooked the entire valley. They dismounted, letting the horses graze on the sweet grass. "You're a good rider," Jed said, a rare compliment from the stoic Nan. "You're a good teacher," she replied, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. The smile transformed her face, lighting it up from within, and Jed felt his breath catch in his throat. In that moment, she was not a victim, not a wounded creature. She was a beautiful, resilient, and incredibly strong woman. And he realized, with a jolt that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that the pity and compassion he felt for her were beginning to evolve into something deeper, something more dangerous. But the sanctuary of their valley was a fragile thing. The world outside, the world that contained the monster with the initial K, had not forgotten her. And as Lily began to heal, to find a sliver of peace in her new life, the shadow of her past was already lengthening, a dark, menacing finger reaching across the plains, ready to reclaim what it considered its rightful property. The brand on her back was more than a scar, it was a homing beacon, and the man who had made it was coming. Chapter 3, The Echo of a Name. The rhythm of life in Jed's Valley was a healing balm. The writing lessons, the shared, silent work, the quiet companionship were all threads in a new tapestry of existence for Lily, one woven with peace and a fragile, burgeoning trust. The brand on her back was still a source of deep, private shame, a secret she hid beneath her clothes, but its power over her was beginning to wane. It was no longer the defining feature of her identity. Here, she was not the branded girl. She was Lily, the woman who could calm a spooked horse with a murmur, whose bread was the best Jed had ever tasted, whose quiet presence had, without his even realizing it, begun to fill the vast, empty spaces in his house and in his heart. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, their edges softened by the reality of her safe, sunlit days. She was beginning to feel a sense of belonging, a concept so foreign to her it was like learning a new language. The land itself was claiming her. She learned its secrets, the hidden spring where the water was sweetest, the patch of wild mint that grew by the riverbank. She was putting down roots, tentative and shallow, but roots nonetheless, in the hard, rocky soil of Jed's world. For his part, Jed was a man in turmoil. The protective, almost paternal feelings he had for Lily were becoming hopelessly entangled with a man's desire. He would watch her body strong and graceful on the back of the mare, her dark hair flying in the wind, and he would be consumed by a feeling so fierce and so tender it left him breathless. He had thought his heart was a dead, barren thing, but Lily was like a gentle, persistent rain, and against all his better judgment, something was beginning to grow there again. He was terrified of these feelings. He felt it was a betrayal of the memory of his wife, Eliza, and he was terrified of what it would mean for Lily. She was a wounded bird, and he was her protector. To introduce the complication of his own desires into their fragile sanctuary felt like a selfish, dangerous act. So he kept his distance, his gruffness a shield for the storm of emotion within him. The outside world, and the past it held, intruded on a hot, cloudless Tuesday in the form of a traveling peddler named Silas. A man Jed tolerated once every few months for the news and supplies he brought. Silas was a weary, gossipy man whose wagon was a rolling emporium of everything from needles and thread to whiskey and wanted posters. Jed and Lily were on the porch when Silas's dusty, creaking wagon rolled into the yard. Lily, who was mending a bridle, immediately tensed, her ingrained fear of strangers making her shrink into herself. "Stay here," Jed said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. "He's harmless. More mouth than man." Jed walked out to meet the peddler, leaving Lily in the relative safety of the porch's shadows. She watched, her hands still, as the two men talked. Silas was animated, waving his arms, a stream of chatter audible even from a distance. "And they say the man's on a tear, Jedediah. A pure tear," Silas's reedy voice carried on the still air. burned a whole settlement down to the ground over in the New Mexico territory, just because he heard a rumor that his property had passed through there. Jed went still, his back to Lily, but she could see the sudden, rigid set of his shoulders. "What property?" Jed asked, his voice carefully casual. "Why, the girl, of course," Silas said, warming to his topic. "The one they call the Gilded Lily, the one who belonged to Silas Kane. You've heard of him, surely. Rich as Croesus, and twice as mean. Owns half the saloons and gambling dens from here to San Francisco. They say this girl was his prized possession, an Irish beauty with hair as black as a raven's wing and eyes to match. Kept her in a gilded cage in his finest establishment in Tombstone. And then, one day, poof, she vanished, slipped away in the dead of night." Lily felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands went cold, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Silas Kane, the name, spoken aloud in her sanctuary, was a physical blow, a branding iron pressed against her soul. The Gilded Lily, the mocking name he had given her, a name that had been whispered in the smoky, perfumed rooms of her prison. Kane's put a bounty on her head, Silas continued, oblivious to the drama unfolding behind Jed. A fortune, $5,000, gold coin. Not for her return, mind you, for proof of her death. He doesn't want her back. He wants her erased. Says if he can't have her, no one will. And the men he's hired to do the job, they're not bounty hunters, Jed. They're wolves. The kind of men who enjoy their work. Jed stood there for a long moment, a statue carved of granite. Then he slowly, deliberately, turned and looked at Lily. Their eyes met across the dusty yard, and in that single, silent glance, everything was confirmed. He saw the stark, naked terror in her eyes, a terror that went beyond her nightmares and into a real, present, and deadly threat. And she saw in his eyes a confirmation of her deepest fear. The monster was not just a memory. He was real, and he was hunting her. Jed turned back to Silas, his face a cold, unreadable mask. "I'll take a box of .40 cartridges, Silas," he said, his voice flat. "And 2 of the larger boxes." Silas's eyes widened. Jed was a man who bought only what he needed, a few cartridges at a time. This was an order for a small war. "Expecting trouble?" Silas asked, a nervous tremor in his voice. "Just a feeling," Jed said. "Best to be prepared." After Silas had left, his wagon creaking away into the distance, leaving a cloud of dust and a pall of dread in its wake, Jed walked back to the porch. Lily was still sitting there, frozen, her face as pale as bleached bone. He sat down on the step below her, not looking at her, giving her space. He knew that the fragile peace they had built had just been shattered. The outside world had come crashing in, and it had a name, Silas Kane. "It's him, isn't it?" he said, his voice a quiet statement, not a question. "The K." She could only nod, a small, jerky movement. The name was a poison on her tongue, and she could not speak it. He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. The silence stretched, filled with the hum of insects and the sound of Lily's ragged breathing. She was waiting for his verdict, waiting for him to tell her to leave, to take her trouble and her death sentence far away from his peaceful valley. She was a magnet for violence, a cursed thing, and she would only bring destruction to this good, quiet man. "I should go," she whispered, the words tasting of ash. "Before he finds me here, before he brings his wolves to your door." Jed turned his head then, and looked up at her. His faded denim eyes were clear and hard, and they held a look of such fierce and wavering resolve that it stole her breath. "No," he said, his voice a low, determined growl that seemed to come from the very depths of his being. "The time for running is over. This is your home now, Lily. And I'll be damned if I let any man, be he a king or a devil, come into my home and try to take what's mine." The word "mine" hung in the air between them. It was not the possessive, ugly word of an owner, the way Cain would have used it. It was the fierce, protective word of a man who was drawing a line in the sand, a man who was claiming not ownership of her, but responsibility for her. He was planting his flag, declaring her a part of his territory, a part of his life, a part of himself. And he was declaring that he would defend her to the death. He stood up, his tall frame blocking out the sun. He looked down at her, and the gruff, stoic rancher was gone. In his place was a warrior, A man who had just found a cause, a reason to fight that went beyond the simple act of survival. "He may have marked you, Lily," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that was absolute. "But you belong here now, with me. And if Silas Kane wants you, he's going to have to come through hell, and through me, to get to you." He reached down and offered her his hand. It was not a gesture of pity, but of partnership. It was an invitation to stand with him, to fight beside him. She looked at his strong, calloused hand, and then up at his determined face. The terror was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. The name of Silas Kane was still a promise of a brutal, violent end. But for the first time, she was not alone in her fear. She had a champion. She had a defender. She placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was strong and sure, a solid, unbreakable anchor in the terrifying storm that was coming for them. The echo of a name had shattered their peace, but it had also forged a new, unbreakable bond between them. They were no longer a man and a refugee. They were partners. And they were preparing for war. Chapter 4: Forging a Weapon. The peddler's visit was a line drawn in time. The days of quiet healing were over, replaced by a new, urgent era of preparation. The valley, which had been a sanctuary, was now a potential battlefield. Jed's promise to Lily was not just a comfort, it was a declaration of war, and he was a man who planned his battles with the same methodical, grim determination he applied to every other aspect of his life. The change in him was profound. The quiet, solitary rancher became a focused, driven commander. His grief, which had so often manifested as a weary resignation, was now channeled into a cold, protective fury. He was no longer just surviving, he was defending. He had something to lose again, and the realization made him both more vulnerable and more dangerous than he had been in years. His first priority was to turn Lily from a victim into a fighter. He knew he could not be with her every second of the day. If Kane's wolves came, she had to be able to defend herself. She had to become a weapon. "You're going to learn to shoot," he announced the morning after Silas's visit, his voice leaving no room for argument. He took her out to a clearing behind the barn. In his hands, he held a small, lightweight Winchester carbine. "This was Eliz's," he said, his voice softening for a moment as he ran a hand over the smooth, worn stock. She wasn't much for guns, but she knew how to use one. "A woman alone in this country needs to." He handed it to Lily. The weapon felt alien in her hands, a heavy, cold piece of metal that hummed with a deadly purpose. It was a tool of the violence she had spent her life fleeing. The smell of gun oil reminded her of the men in Kane's saloons, their pistols tucked into their belts, their casual cruelty a constant, menacing presence. Her first instinct was to drop it, to recoil from it. "I can't," she whispered, her hands trembling. Jed's voice was firm, but not unkind. "You have to, Lily. The fear you feel for this," he said, tapping the rifle, "is nothing compared to the fear you'll feel if one of Kane's men is standing in front of you and you have no way to stop him. This isn't a tool for killing. It's a tool for living. It's the one thing that will let you say no and make it stick." His logic was brutal and inescapable. He was right. She had said no to Kane's men 100 times, and it had meant nothing. The rifle was a different kind of answer. And so, her training began. Jed was a patient, relentless teacher. He started with the basics, making her take the rifle apart and put it back together until she could do it in the dark. He taught her the names of every part, the mechanics of how it worked. He wanted her to understand it, to strip it of its malevolent mystery and see it for what it was, a machine. Then came the shooting. At first, she couldn't even hold it steady. She would flinch before she even pulled the trigger, her eyes squeezed shut. The loud report made her jump, and the kick against her shoulder was a jarring, unfamiliar blow. Her first shots went wide, kicking up dust far from the row of tin cans he had set up on a fence post. "Don't fight it," he told her, his voice a low, calm presence behind her. He stood close, adjusting her stance, his hands briefly, impersonally, on her shoulders and arms. "Become a part of it. Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it. Squeeze it slow, like you're squeezing the last drop of water from a cloth." Day after day, they practiced. The clearing echoed with the sound of her shots. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to improve. The flinch subsided. Her hands grew steady. And one afternoon, a tin can flew off the fence post with a satisfying ping. A small, surprised smile touched her lips. Again, he said, his own face betraying a flicker of pride. Soon, one can became two, then three. She discovered she had a good eye and natural, steady aim. The rifle no longer felt like a foreign object. It felt like an extension of her will. The fear she had felt for it was replaced by a sense of grim, powerful satisfaction. Jed was right. This was the feeling of being able to say no. But Jed's preparations were not limited to teaching Lily to shoot. He began to systematically turn his isolated ranch into a small, defensible fortress. He and Lily worked together, a silent, efficient team. They reinforced the doors and windows of the main house. They cleared the brush from around the perimeter of the yard, eliminating any potential hiding spots. Jed chose several defensive positions, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the main approach, the hayloft of the barn, a shallow ditch near the creek, and they stocked each position with a small cache of ammunition and water. He was teaching her not just to fight, but to think like a fighter, to see the land not just for its beauty, but for its tactical possibilities. Never let them know where you are, he told her, his finger tracing lines in the dust. Always have more than one way out. A cornered animal is a dead animal. The shared work, the common purpose, forged a new, deeper intimacy between them. The unspoken desire was still there, a constant, humming undercurrent, but it was now woven into a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared sense of urgency. They were soldiers together, preparing for a battle for their lives. In the evenings, exhausted from their work, they would sit on the porch, the silence between them no longer awkward, but a comfortable, shared quiet. In these moments of peace, the walls between them would sometimes crumble. "Eliza, my wife, she would have liked you," he said one evening, his voice startlingly soft. "She was gentle, but she was strong too. Like you." It was the first time he had compared her to his wife, not as a replacement, but as an equal, and the gesture touched a place deep inside her that she had thought was long dead. "Tell me about her," she said, her voice quiet. And so he did. He told her about the girl he had met at a town dance, the girl with the laugh like wind chimes. He told her about their dreams, about building this ranch together. And he told her about the fever, about the terrible, helpless feeling of watching the two people who were his entire world slip away from him. His confession was a gift, a sharing of the great, defining sorrow of his life. And in return, Lily found herself, for the first time, able to speak of her own past, not in the tortured sobs of a nightmare, but in the quiet, sad words of a survivor. She told him about the orphanage, about the nuns who were both cruel and kind. And she told him, in halting, fragmented sentences, about the day Silas Kane had come, a wealthy, charming benefactor, looking to adopt an older girl to be his ward. She had been chosen. She told him, because she was pretty, and because she had a defiant spark in her eye that he had found amusing. "He told me he would give me a beautiful life," she said, her voice a dead, emotionless monotone as she stared out at the darkening plains. "A life of silk dresses and fine food." He called his saloon the Gilded Cage. It was a fitting name. I was his prize bird, the one he showed off to his rich friends, the one he kept locked away from the world. She stopped, the rest of the story a dark, ugly thing she could not yet bring herself to voice. Jed did not press her. He just sat there, his silent, solid presence a testament that he was listening, that he was not judging. "He liked to collect beautiful things," she whispered, her hand unconsciously going to her shoulder, to the spot on her back where the brand was hidden beneath her dress. "And he liked to put his mark on them, so everyone would know they belonged to him." Jed's hand clenched into a fist on his knee, his knuckles white, but he said nothing. He was beginning to understand the true, deep nature of the monster they were waiting for. Kane was not just a criminal. He was a man who took pleasure in breaking things, in owning souls. The training, the fortifications, the shared confessions, they were all part of the same process. They were forging a partnership, a fortress of two against the coming storm. But more than that, Jed was forging a new weapon. He was taking the broken, terrified woman he had found and was helping her to reforge herself. He was teaching her that the fire that had been used to brand her could also be used to temper steel. And the woman who was emerging from that fire was someone that even Silas Kane would not recognize, a survivor, with a rifle in her hand and a core of unshakable, hard-won strength in her soul. Chapter 5: The First Shot. The waiting was a poison. After the initial flurry of preparation, a tense, watchful quiet settled over the valley. Every sunrise brought a fresh wave of anxiety, every sunset a feeling of borrowed time. They scanned the horizon until their eyes ached, listening for the sound of hoofbeats that was not their own. The valley, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap, its beautiful, mountainous walls a cage from which there was no escape. The strain began to wear on them. Jed grew more taciturn, his silence heavier, his eyes constantly scanning, his hand never far from his Colt. Lily, despite her newfound skills with the rifle, found the old fears creeping back in the dead of night. The waiting was, in some ways, worse than the fight itself. It was a war of nerves, and she knew it was a war that Silas Kane was an expert at waging. He would be enjoying this. The thought of her, trapped and terrified, waiting for his arrival, their salvation, and their first test, came from an unexpected quarter. It was a blistering hot afternoon. Jed was out on the far pasture, rounding up some stray cattle that had wandered into a box canyon. Lily was alone at the ranch house, baking bread, the familiar, domestic task, a small anchor in the sea of her anxiety. She heard the sound first, a low, pain bellowing from the direction of the creek. It was not the sound of a healthy cow. It was a sound of distress. Wiping the flour from her hands, she took Liz's carbine from its place by the door. It was her constant companion, knowing when to investigate. She found him in the shallow, muddy water of the creek. A young bull, one of Jed's prize animals, had slipped on the muddy bank and broken its leg. The bone was protruding from the hide, a gruesome and natural sight. The animal was in agony, its eyes rolling with pain and fear. Lily's heart went out to it. She knew what had to be done. A broken leg like that, for an animal of this size, was a death sentence. To leave it to suffer was a cruelty she could not abide. Jed would have to put it down when he got back. She was about to turn and go for help when she saw them. Two riders, on the opposite bank of the creek, half hidden in a grove of cottonwoods. They were not cowboys. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces hard and unshaven, and they were watching the bull with the cold, calculating eyes of predators. They had rifles across their saddles. They hadn't seen her yet. She ducked behind a large boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs. Kane's men. They had to be. The wolves had arrived. They were talking, their voices carrying on the still, hot air. "Look at that," one of them said, a cruel chuckle in his voice. "Dinner, just waiting for us." "That's one of Thorne's bulls, for sure. A fine piece of meat." Kane said, "No shooting unless we have to," the other one said, his voice a low growl. "He wants the girl first. He wants the rancher to watch." "Kane ain't here," the first one countered. "And I'm hungry. Besides, a single shot, who's to say it wasn't the rancher himself, putting the poor beast out of its misery?" He raised his rifle, taking casual aim at the struggling bull's head. A wave of pure, cold fury washed over Lily. They were going to kill Jed's animal. For sport, for a meal. They were trespassing on his land, planning to do violence to him and to her, and they were going to start with this act of casual, arrogant cruelty. All of Jed's training, all the hours in the hot sun, all the lessons on breathing and squeezing and making every shot count, coalesced in that single, white-hot moment. She rose from behind the boulder, the carbine coming to her shoulder as if it were a part of her. She did not think. She acted. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a woman defending her home. She did not aim at the man. She aimed at the ground, a foot in front of his horse's hooves. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of the carbine was sharp and loud, a sudden, violent punctuation to the afternoon's quiet. A puff of dust and pebbles exploded in front of the man's horse. The animal screamed in terror and reared, its front hooves flailing in the air. The man, caught by surprise, cursed and fought to stay in the saddle. The second man, his eyes wide with shock, spun around, trying to locate the source of the shot. He saw her then, a lone woman, standing in the open, a smoking rifle in her hands. "What the hell?" he spat. "Get off this land," Lily's voice rang out, clear and steady, with a confidence she didn't know she possessed. "This is private property. You are not welcome here." The first rider finally got his horse under control. His face was a mask of pure, murderous rage. "Why, you little bitch," he snarled. "You've just made a fatal mistake." He swung his rifle around, aiming it at her. But Lily was already moving. As he was aiming, she was reloading, her hands working with a swift, practiced efficiency. She levered another cartridge into the chamber and fired again, before he could even get a bead on her. This time, she didn't aim at the ground. She aimed at the thick, fleshy part of the saddle on his horse, just behind his leg. The bullet tore through the leather with a loud thwack. It didn't hit the horse or the man, but it was a message, delivered with terrifying precision. The next one will not miss. The man's horse, already spooked, screamed again and bolted, tearing off through the trees, its rider cursing and struggling to regain control. The second man stared, his mouth agape. He had come here expecting to find a terrified, helpless girl. He had found a sharpshooter with nerves of steel. He looked at her, at the cold, determined look in her eyes, at the rifle that was now swinging around to cover him. He was a bully and a hired gun, not a soldier. He was being paid to hunt a girl, not to fight a war with some kind of prairie Amazon. He made his decision. He held up a hand, a gesture of grudging surrender. "All right, lady," he said, his voice shaky. "All right, we're going." He backed his horse up slowly, then turned and galloped after his companion, disappearing into the trees. Lily stood there, the rifle still at her shoulder, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the pained cries of the bull. She had done it. She had faced them down. She had fired the first shot in their war, and she had won the first battle. She lowered the rifle, her knees feeling weak. The grim reality of the situation came crashing back in on her. She looked at the bull, still suffering. She knew what she had to do. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she walked to the edge of the creek. She raised the rifle one more time, her aim steady and sure. She looked into the animal's pained eyes and whispered a soft apology. "I'm sorry," she said. And she fired. The sound of that final, merciful shot was what Jed heard as he galloped into the yard, his face a mask of frantic worry. He had heard the first two shots from the canyon and had ridden back as if the devil himself were on his tail, his mind filled with 1,000 terrible possibilities. He burst through the trees and saw the scene, the dead bull in the creek, and Lily, standing over it, a smoking rifle in her hands, her face pale but her back ramrod straight. "Lily," he cried, leaping from his horse before it had even come to a full stop. "Are you all right? What happened?" She turned to him, and her composure, which had held through the entire, terrifying ordeal, finally crumbled. The rifle slipped from her fingers. "They were here, Jed," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Two of them. Kane's men. They were going to. I had to." He was at her side in an instant, his arms going around her, pulling her into a fierce, protective embrace. He held her tight as her story tumbled out, a torrent of frightened, triumphant words. He held her at arm's length, his hands on her shoulders, and looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. The fear was in her eyes, but there was something else, too. A new, hard-won strength. A fierce pride. "You did good, Lily," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was part relief, part a love so fierce it almost choked him. "You did more than good. You were magnificent." He knew, in that moment, that the wolves had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated their prey. They had thought they were hunting a gilded lily, a fragile, broken thing. They had no idea that they were hunting a desert hawk, with talons of steel and a spirit that would not be broken. The first shot had been fired, and it had been fired by her. The war had come to their valley, and Lily had just announced, in a language of gunpowder and courage, that she was ready to fight it. Chapter 6: A Promise in the Dark. The encounter at the creek was a turning point. It was a brutal, violent confirmation that the threat was no longer a distant possibility, but a clear and present danger at their doorstep. But it was also a profound victory. Lily had faced down two of Kane's men and had not just survived. She had prevailed. The incident transformed her, burning away the last, clinging vestiges of the terrified victim and forging in its place a quiet, determined warrior. The change was visible in the way she carried herself. Her shoulders were straighter, her gaze more direct. The rifle was no longer a burden, but a familiar tool she carried with a casual competence. She had been tested, and she had not been found wanting. The power Jed had sought to give her, she had now fully claimed as her own. For Jed, watching her, his heart was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. There was an immense, fierce pride that made his chest swell. But there was also a deep, chilling fear. He had wanted her to be able to defend herself, but seeing her forced to do so, seeing the hardness that had crept into her beautiful, dark eyes, was a pain sharp as a knife. He had brought her to this sanctuary to heal, and instead, he had brought her to a new war. The guilt was a heavy stone in his gut. The atmosphere at the ranch became a state of siege. They were no longer just waiting, they were on high alert. One of them was always on watch, their eyes constantly scanning the ridges that surrounded the valley. They ate in shifts, their meals tense, their ears strained for any unnatural sound. Sleep was a stolen luxury, taken in brief, restless snatches. The two men Lily had driven off would have returned to Cain. They knew now where she was. And they knew that the man sheltering her was not a man to be trifled with. Cain would not send just 2 men next time. He would come himself. He would come with an army. He'll come for the satisfaction of it, Jed said one evening, as they sat on the porch, the deep purple twilight settling over the valley. The rifle lay across Lily's lap. It's not about the bounty anymore. It's about his pride. You defied him. You escaped. And now you've made his men look like fools. He can't let that stand. So, he will come to destroy this place, Lily said, her voice a flat, resigned statement. To punish you for helping me. He'll come to try, Jed corrected her, his voice a low growl. The weight of what she had brought to his door was a crushing burden on Lily's soul. This is my fault, Jed, she whispered, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. All of this. Your life was quiet before I fell on your doorstep. Now I've brought a war to you. You should have just let me die in the storm. Jed turned to her, his face grim in the fading light. Don't you ever say that, he said, his voice fierce, cutting through the quiet. My life wasn't quiet, Lily. It was empty. It was a long, slow death of the soul. I was just a ghost, rattling around in a house full of other ghosts. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. You, he said, his voice dropping, becoming thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. You came here, and you brought this place back to life. You brought me back to life. I haven't felt anything but grief and anger in 5 years. But now I feel everything. He looked at her, and in the deep twilight, his guard was finally, completely down. The stoic cowboy, the grieving widower, was gone. There was only a man, his heart laid bare. I'm not protecting you out of some sense of duty, Lily. I'm protecting you because the thought of him, of anyone, laying a hand on you, it's a thought I can't abide. I'm protecting you because a world without you in it is not a world I want to live in anymore. The confession, rare and unadorned, was more powerful than any flowery poem. It was the simple, stark, and terrifying truth. He was in love with her. Tears welled in Lily's eyes, blurring the stars that were beginning to appear in the velvet sky. But I am broken, Jed, she whispered, the old shame, the old feeling of being dirty, rising up. What he did to me, the brand, it's a part of me. It's an ugliness I can never wash away. To hell with the brand, he said, his voice a fierce, ragged whisper. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss into her palm, a gesture of such profound, unexpected tenderness that it shattered the last of her defenses. That brand isn't you. It's his sin, not yours. When I look at you, I don't see a brand. I see the strongest, bravest woman I have ever known. I see a survivor. I see beauty. He stood up then, pulling her gently to her feet. He stood before her, his large frame a fortress of strength and warmth in the cool night air. I made you a promise when you first came here, that I would keep you safe. Now I'm making you another one. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. His touch was not one of passion, but of a deep, solemn reverence. I promise you, Lily, on the memory of my wife and my child, on every acre of this land that I love, that I will not let him have you. I will stand between you and him, and he will have to kill me and grind my bones to dust before he can lay a finger on you. This is my vow. And then he kissed her. It was not the hungry, passionate kiss of a lover, but something far deeper. It was a kiss of promise, of fealty, of a soul pledging itself to another. It was a seal on the vow he had just made, a vow made in the darkness, under the watchful eyes of a million distant stars. When he pulled back, they were both trembling. The unspoken thing that had been between them for so long was finally out in the open, a beautiful, terrifying, and powerful force. "Jed," she breathed, her voice thick with tears. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice gentle. "I know you're not ready, and I won't ever be the kind of man who pushes. But I needed you to know the truth. I needed you to know why I'm fighting. It's not for a principle, Lily. It's for you." From that night on, everything was different. The fear was still there, a cold, constant companion. But it was now outweighed by something far more powerful. They were no longer just partners in survival. They were two people bound by a love that had been forged in the most impossible of circumstances. The preparations for the coming fight took on a new, more desperate intensity. It was not just about defending a piece of land anymore. It was about defending a future they had only just, in a whispered promise in the dark, allowed themselves to believe in. Jed began to sleep on the floor in the main room, just outside her bedroom door. He said it was so he could hear if anyone approached the house, but they both knew the real reason. He was a sentinel, a guardian who would not rest, a physical manifestation of the promise he had made. Lily, for her part, found a new source of strength. She was no longer just fighting against her past, she was fighting for her future. For the first time in her life, she had something to lose that was more precious than her own life. She had Jed. They were an island, a tiny bastion of love and defiance against a coming tide of hatred and violence. They did not know when Cain would come, or how many men he would bring. They only knew that they would face him together. The promise made in the dark was their shield, their banner, their one true weapon against the monster who was coming to claim them. Chapter 7. The Gilded Cage. The calm before the storm was an unnerving, surreal period. The valley was bathed in the brilliant, relentless light of the late summer sun. The meadows were alive with the buzz of insects, and the sky was a deep and troubled blue. It was a world of profound peace, a peace that was a lie. Jed and Lily moved through these beautiful, sun-drenched days with the grim, focused intensity of soldiers on the eve of a great battle. Every beautiful sunset, every cool, star-dusted night, felt like it could be their last. Jed's declaration of love, and the solemn vow that had accompanied it, had changed the very air they breathed. The last walls between them had crumbled. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a deep, tender intimacy that needed few words. It was in the way he would touch the small of her back as he passed behind her, a small, reassuring gesture of presence. It was in the way she would bring him a cup of coffee at dawn, her hand lingering on his for a moment longer than necessary. The love was a tangible thing now, a quiet, powerful force that filled the small spaces of their lives. But it was a love born under a death sentence, and this knowledge gave every shared moment a poignant, desperate beauty. They were truly partners now, in every sense of the word. Jed, recognizing Lily's sharp mind and keen instincts, began to include her in the strategic planning of their defense. They would spend hours poring over a rough map of the valley he had drawn in the dirt, planning lines of fire, escape routes, fallback positions. Cain will be arrogant, Jed reasoned, his finger tracing the main path into the valley. He'll expect to ride in here and find us cowering in the house. He won't be expecting a fight in the open. Our best chance is to hit them before they even reach the yard. He'll send scouts first, Lily added, her voice quiet but sure. She knew the man's methods. He'll want to know the lay of the land, to know our strength. He will not be reckless. He is a cat, and he loves to play with his food before he eats it. Her insight was chilling, but invaluable. She knew the mind of their enemy. She was their greatest strategic asset. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the weight of the coming battle heavy in the air, Jed finally asked the question he had held back for so long. "Tell me about him, Lily," he said, his voice gentle. "Tell me everything. I need to know the man I'm going to kill." Lily was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. The story was a venomous, coiled snake in her heart, and to speak it aloud was to risk being bitten again. But she looked at Jed, at his strong, steady face, at the unwavering love in his eyes, and she knew she owed him the truth. She also knew that for her to truly be free, she had to finally face the monster, not just with a rifle, but with her own voice. She had to tell her own story. "His name is Silas Kane," she began, her voice a low, flat monotone, a voice she used to distance herself from the pain of the memories. "But in the places he owns, they call him the collector, because, as he likes to say, he collects beautiful, rare, and broken things." And so, she told him. She told him of the St. Jude's orphanage in St. Louis, a place of gray walls and thin blankets, where she had lived since she was 5, her Irish immigrant parents taken by cholera. She told him of the day Kane had arrived, a vision of wealth and charm in a tailored suit, his pockets full of sweets for the children, his eyes cold and assessing, like a man judging horseflesh. He had chosen her, a scrawny, defiant 13-year-old, telling the Mother Superior he wished to give her a life of education and refinement. "He took me to Tombstone," she said, her eyes losing focus, seeing a past that was more vivid than the fire in front of her. "To his saloon, the Gilded Cage. It was the most beautiful and the most ugly place I have ever seen. All red velvet and gold leaf and crystal chandeliers. And it was my prison." She described a life of surreal, suffocating luxury. He had dressed her in silk and lace, hired tutors to teach her to read and play the piano. She was his prize, his pet, the beautiful, cultured ward he would show off to his business associates. She was a symbol of his power, a testament that he could take a piece of street refuse and turn it into a lady. "But there were rules," she whispered, her hands clenching in her lap. "I was not allowed to speak unless spoken to. I was not allowed to leave the rooms he kept for me on the top floor of the saloon, unless he was with me. The windows were barred with beautiful, gilded ironwork that looked like vines, but they were bars all the same." As she grew older, from a girl into a woman, Kane's tutelage took a darker, more sinister turn. "He began to teach me about his business," she said, the words tasting like poison. "About how to spot a cheat at the card table. About how to pour a drink to make a man talk. He was grooming me, Jed. He was turning me into his most valuable tool." And then she told him about the brand. "It happened on my 16th birthday," she said, her voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper, her body beginning to tremble. "He told me he had a special gift for me. He said it was time for me to become a true part of his collection. He said that a man must mark what is his, so there can be no confusion." She described the scene in horrific, vivid detail, the two large, thuggish men who had held her down, the smell of the burning charcoal in the brazier, the sight of the beautiful, serpentine branding iron glowing red-hot, and Kane, standing over her, his face not contorted with anger, but with a look of calm, possessive pleasure, as he pressed the iron to her flesh. "He told me that the pain was a gift," she choked out, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "A gift that would bind me to him forever. He said that now, I was truly his, inside and out." Jed listened, his face a mask of stone, but a muscle was jumping in his jaw, and his hands were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. The cold, murderous rage he had felt when he had first seen the brand returned tenfold. He was not just going to kill this man. He was going to erase him from the face of the earth. "After that," Lily continued, her voice ragged, "I was no longer just his ward. I became his gilded lily. He would make me serve drinks to his most important guests. He never let them touch me. I was too valuable for that. I was his alone. But he would make me sit there, in my fine dresses, a beautiful, branded object, while they talked of their wicked schemes. It was a different kind of violation, a slow death of the soul." She told him of her escape. It had been an act of desperate and planned courage. A drunken guest had cornered her, his hands grabbing at her, and in a moment of pure, blind panic, she had smashed a bottle over his head. In the ensuing chaos, knowing that Kane's punishment for this would be worse than death, she had simply run. She had climbed out a back window, shimmied down a drainpipe, and had fled into the night with nothing but the clothes on her back. "I have been running ever since," she finished, her story finally told. She was exhausted, drained, her body shaking with the force of the memories she had unearthed. "From town to town, working odd jobs, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for his wolves to find me." The fire crackled, the only sound in the room. The story hung between them, a raw, ugly testament to the depths of human cruelty. Jed finally moved. He left his chair and knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He just held her hands, his grip a solid, grounding force, and he let his presence be his answer. His collection is about to get smaller by one, he said, his voice a low, deadly promise. He will never touch you again, Lily. He will never hurt anyone again. That is my vow. She looked at him, her dark, tear-filled eyes meeting his, and she saw not pity, but a shared, righteous fury. He was not just her protector. He was her avenger. In sharing her story, in giving voice to the horrors of the gilded cage, Lily had not found absolution. But she had found something just as powerful. She had taken the ugliest, most painful part of her life and had shared its weight. And in doing so, she had robbed it of its power to haunt her in solitude. The monster was no longer a secret shame, a demon that lived only in her nightmares. He was a man, of flesh and blood, a man with a name, and he was coming. But now, she would not be facing him alone. She would be facing him with a man who knew the truth, and who had sworn to be her sword and her shield. The final battle for her soul was about to begin. Chapter 8. The Wolves at the Door. The telling of Lily's story was a final, necessary exorcism. It lanced the wound of her past, and though the process was agonizing, it allowed the real healing to begin. The secret she had carried, the shame that had defined her, was now a shared burden. The monster now had a face and a name, and he was no longer a shadowy figure in her nightmares, but a flesh and blood enemy they would face together. A new, calmer, but more determined atmosphere settled over the ranch. The frantic energy of their initial preparations was replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. They were as ready as they could ever be. The fortifications were complete, the ammunition was cached, and their strategy was set. Now, all that was left was the waiting. The first sign came, as Lily had predicted, in the form of scouts. Jed spotted them at dawn, two riders silhouetted against the blood-red sunrise on the eastern ridge. They were too far away to make out any details, but they were not cowboys. They sat their horses with a stillness, an unnerving patience, that spoke of men who were hunting, not hurting. "They're here," he said, his voice a low, grim statement. He was standing at the window of the main room, a spyglass to his eye. Lily came to stand beside him, her own rifle in her hand. "Just two," she said, her voice steady. "They're testing our defenses, seeing how we react." "Then we won't," Jed replied. "We'll let them think we don't see them. We'll let them get comfortable. Let them get arrogant." For 2 days, the silent, deadly game of cat and mouse played out. The two scouts would appear at different points on the ridges surrounding the valley, watching, always watching. Jed and Lily went about their daily chores as if nothing was amiss, but it was a carefully orchestrated performance. They were always aware of being watched, always conscious of the unseen eyes that followed their every move. They never moved about together, ensuring one of them was always in a protected, defensive position. On the third day, the scouts grew bolder. They rode down from the ridge and into the valley itself, though they kept their distance from the ranch house, circling the pastures, their message clear: "We are here. We own this valley now. We are just waiting for the master to arrive." It was a war of psychological attrition, designed to fray their nerves, to make them exhausted and prone to mistakes before the real battle even began. "Today," Jed said at midday, his eyes narrowed as he watched the two riders, who had dismounted by the creek. "Today, we give them something to take back to their master." His plan was risky, but it was brilliant. He was going to use their arrogance against them. He saddled his horse, the powerful black stallion named Diablo. "I'm going to ride out to the north pasture," he told Lily. "I'm going to make it look like I'm checking on the herd, like I'm oblivious. They'll follow me. They'll think I'm alone and that you're helpless in the house. And while they're watching you," Lily said, her mind already grasping his strategy, "you will be waiting for them," he finished, "at the rocky outcrop. You'll have a clear line of sight to the creek. Don't show yourself until I'm well clear. I want you to give them a message. I don't want you to kill them. Not yet. I want you to scare the living hell out of them. I want them to go back to Cain and tell him that the gilded lily is not the frightened little bird he remembers." The trust he was placing in her was immense. He was using himself as bait, trusting her skill, her nerve, to protect his back. "Be careful, Jed," she said, her voice tight with a fear that was entirely for him. He touched her cheek, a brief, gentle gesture. "You too," he said. And then he was on Diablo, riding out, not towards the creek, but in the opposite direction, alone, and suspecting figure moving across the vast, open pasture. Lily, her heart pounding, slipped out the back of the house and made her way, a ghost in the midday shadows, towards the rocky outcrop they had designated as their primary sniper's nest. It was a perfect position, offering a commanding view of the valley and excellent cover. She settled in, her body hidden by the sun-warmed rocks, the barrel of her rifle resting in a natural V-shape in the stone. From here, she could see it all. She saw Jed, a distant figure on his horse. And she saw the two scouts, their attention immediately drawn to him. Just as Jed had predicted, they mounted up and began to follow him at a distance, their posture relaxed, confident. They were two wolves, shadowing alone and suspecting sheep. They had no idea the trap was about to be sprung. Lily waited, her breathing slow and even, just as Jed had taught her. She was not afraid. She was a hunter. The land was her ally. She waited until the scouts had moved into the open, their backs to her, their entire focus on the distant figure of Jed. She took her time. She chose her target, not the men, but their canteens, hanging from their saddle horns. It was a difficult shot, a small target at over 200 yards. But it was a shot that would deliver a message of terrifying precision. She let out a long, slow breath and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, the first scout's horse shied, and the man looked down to see water gushing from a neat, round hole in his canteen. He swore, spinning around in his saddle, his eyes scanning the seemingly empty landscape, looking for the source of the impossible shot. Before he could find it, Lily's rifle cracked again. The second scout cried out as his own canteen exploded, spraying water all over his leg. Panic erupted. They were being shot at by a ghost, with a skill that was almost supernatural. They spurred their horses, galloping wildly, no longer stalking, but fleeing. Lily fired a third time. The bullet whizzed past the first man's head, so close he must have felt the wind of its passage, and kicked up a puff of dust on a rock just in front of him. It was the final, terrifying message: I can kill you whenever I want. I'm just choosing not to. The two men, their nerve completely broken, did not even look back. They galloped their horses flat out, heading for the eastern ridge, for the safety of their camp, for the man who had so grievously underestimated the woman he was hunting. Lily watched them go, a small, grim smile touching her lips. The message had been delivered. She made her way back to the house just as Jed was riding in, his own face set in a mask of tense anticipation. "They're gone," she said simply. He looked at her, at the quiet, confident strength in her eyes, and a slow grin spread across his face. "Did you leave them anything to drink?" he asked. "Only their own fear," she replied. They both knew this small victory was only a temporary reprieve. The scouts would report back to Kane. They would tell him of a ghost who could shoot the eye out of a fly at 200 yards. Kane's arrogance would curdle into a rage. He would no longer be patient. He would no longer play games. "He's coming now, Jed," Lily said, her voice sober. "He's coming with everyone he has." "I know," Jed replied, his grin fading, replaced by a grim resolve. "Let him come. We'll be ready." They stood together on the porch, watching the eastern ridge, a united front, a fortress of two. The first shots of the war had been fired. The wolves had been sent scurrying back to their master. But the master of the pack was now enraged, and he was about to be unleashed upon their valley. The final, bloody battle was no longer a question of if, but when. And when was going to be very, very soon. Chapter 9, The Siege of Stone Ranch. The 2 days that followed Lily's masterful display of marksmanship were the quietest, and the most terrifying, they had yet endured. The scouts were gone. The ridges were empty. The valley was preternaturally still, held in a breathless, waiting silence, like the dead calm in the eye of a hurricane. They knew this was not a retreat. It was the gathering of the storm. Kane was marshaling his forces. He was coming. Jed and Lily used the time to make their final preparations. They moved most of their supplies, water, food, ammunition, medical provisions into the root cellar, which they had designated as their final, most defensible fallback position. They talked through their strategy one last time, every contingency, every possibility. There was a quiet, grim finality to their actions. They were to soldiers on the eve of a battle from which they might not return. The love between them, now openly acknowledged, was a source of both immense strength and profound, aching pain. Every shared glance, every touch, was freighted with the possibility that it might be their last. On the second night, they did not sleep in separate rooms. Lily came to him, a silent specter in the moonlight, and they made love with a desperate, tender intensity, an affirmation of life in the very face of death. It was not an act of passion, but of consecration, a final, sacred vow of two souls bound together, for whatever time they had left. The dawn of the third day broke, gray and ominous. And with it, they came. They were not just a posse, they were an army. At least 15 riders, pouring over the eastern ridge like a dark, malevolent tide. They were not the hired thugs of a saloon owner. They were hard-faced, professional gunmen, mercenaries who killed for coin. And at their head, on a magnificent black stallion, was a man who could only be Silas Kane. Even at a distance, he radiated an aura of cold, reptilian power. He was dressed in a fine, tailored black coat, a stark, civilized figure at the head of a pack of wolves. "It's him," Lily whispered, her voice tight, her hand gripping her rifle. She was in her position in the rocky outcrop. Jed was in the hayloft of the barn, his Winchester resting on a bale of hay. They were a crossfire, a deadly trap. Kane's army rode into the valley with an arrogant and hurried confidence. They did not expect a fight. They expected a surrender. Kane reined in his horse 100 yards from the ranch house and surveyed the scene, a look of contemptuous ownership on his handsome, cruel face. Jedediah Stone, his voice boomed, amplified by the valley's natural acoustics. "You have something that belongs to me. Send out the girl, and I will let you live. Refuse, and I will burn this pathetic little kingdom of yours to the ground and salt the earth where it stood." There was no answer but the whisper of the wind. Kane's face darkened. "So be it," he snarled. He raised his hand and gave a sharp, forward command. His men dismounted, spreading out, advancing on the ranch house with a practiced, military precision. The battle for Stone Ranch had begun. The first shot came from Lily. She waited until the men were in the open, fully committed, and then she fired. One of the advancing gunmen cried out, clutching his leg as he tumbled to the ground. Chaos erupted. Kane's men, who had been expecting a simple siege of the house, were suddenly under fire from an unseen, elevated position. They dove for whatever cover they could find, rocks, a shallow ditch, the water trough. Then Jed opened up from the barn, his Winchester barking, creating a devastating crossfire. Another of Kane's men fell, shot cleanly through the chest. The arrogant advance had turned into a desperate, pinned-down scramble for survival. Kane, his face a mask of disbelief and pure fury, roared at his men to return fire. The air was suddenly filled with the roar of gunfire, bullets chewing at the rocks around Lily, thudding into the thick timbers of the barn. It was a battle of strategy against brute force. Kane had the numbers, but Jed and Lily had the terrain, the preparation, and the element of surprise. They fired sparingly, their shots precise and deadly, making every bullet count. Lily, from her perch, was a ghost, a phantom sniper. She would fire from one position, then crawl to another, never giving them a fixed target. Jed, in the barn, was a rock, his fire steady and relentless, pinning them down. But Kane's men were professionals. Under the direction of a burly, bearded man who was clearly Kane's second in command, they began to organize. They laid down a heavy, suppressing fire on the barn and the rocks, while a small group of them began to circle wide, trying to flank Lily's position. "Lily, they're coming for you," Jed shouted, his voice barely audible over the din of the battle. "I see them," she shouted back. She was trapped. 3 men were advancing on her position, using the terrain for cover, getting closer. She took down one of them with a clean shot, but the other 2 were almost upon her. Just as they were about to charge her position, a new sound entered the battle, the deep-throated boom of Jed's shotgun. He had abandoned the hayloft and had come out of the barn, a flanking move of his own, catching the men who were stalking Lily in a brutal, close-range crossfire. One of the men screamed as the buckshot tore into him. The other turned, startled, only to be met by a bullet from Lily's rifle. But in that moment of brave, Reckless exposure, another of Kane's men, positioned near the house, took his shot. Jed cried out a sharp, ragged sound of pain, and fell, his shotgun clattering on the ground. "Jed!" Lily screamed, her heart stopping. She saw him, lying on the ground, trying to crawl back to the cover of the barn, his side a mass of blood. Her blood ran cold, then hot with a rage so pure and so absolute it burned away all her fear. Kane's men, seeing Jed fall, let out a triumphant roar and began to advance again. Lily rose from her cover, no longer a sniper, but an avenging angel. She stood in the open, in plain sight, and began to fire, her movements a blur of deadly efficiency. She was not just shooting, she was fighting, her rifle a sword, every bullet a cry of defiance. She dropped another of Kane's men, then another, her accuracy born of a cold, white-hot fury. The remaining gunmen, stunned by this suicidal, one-woman stand, faltered. From his position of safety behind a large boulder, Silas Kane watched, his face a mask of utter disbelief. This was not the broken, terrified girl he had branded. This was a demon, a Valkyria, a goddess of war. And she was destroying his army. He raised his own, pearl-handled revolver, his rage finally overriding his sense of self-preservation. "She's mine," he screamed, and he stepped out from behind the rock, aiming at her. But in that moment, Jed, lying on the ground, bleeding, pushed himself up onto one elbow. He raised his Colt, his hand shaking, his vision blurring. He saw Kane, saw him aiming at Lily. He saw the woman he loved, standing exposed, fighting for him. With the last of his strength, he cocked the hammer, took aim, and fired. The shot was true. Silas Kane grunted, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down at the small, dark hole that had appeared in the chest of his fine, black coat. Then he looked at Lily, a final, uncomprehending look, before he crumpled to the ground, dead. The death of their leader broke the last of the gunmen's will. They had come for gold, not to die in this god-forsaken valley at the hands of a ghost and a dying man. They scrambled for their horses and fled, a routed, broken army, leaving their dead and wounded behind. And then, there was silence. A sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the wind and the groans of a few wounded men. Lily ran to Jed, her rifle falling from her numb fingers. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands fluttering over the terrible, bloody wound in his side. "Jed, Jed, stay with me," she sobbed, the tears she had held back for so long finally breaking free. He looked up at her, his face pale as death, pain smile touching his lips. "Knew you had it in you," he whispered, his voice a faint, ragged breath. "My beautiful Lily." And then his eyes closed, and his head lolled to the side. The siege was over. The monster was dead. But the price of their victory was a cost she was not sure she could bear to pay. Chapter 10: Scars of the Dawn. The silence that descended upon the valley in the aftermath of the battle was a heavy, suffocating thing. It was the silence of death, of spent gunpowder, of a world holding its breath. For Lily, that silence was a roaring in her ears, a void where the sound of Jed's heartbeat should have been. She knelt in the dust, his blood warm and sticky on her hands, his limp, heavy form a dead weight in her arms. The victory was ash in her mouth. Silas Kane was dead, his reign of terror over. His wolves were scattered to the winds. She was free, but the freedom felt like a hollow, meaningless prize in the face of this new, all-consuming loss. She had found a home, only to have its foundation ripped out from under her. She had found love, only to have it stolen away in a final, heroic act of sacrifice. A despair so black and so absolute that it threatened to swallow her whole washed over her. It would be so easy to just stop, to lie down in the dust next to him and let the sun and the silence take her, too. But then, a small, insistent sound broke through the fog of her grief. It was the sound of a screen door creaking open. Caleb. She had forgotten the boy, hidden away in the cellar, a small, terrified witness to the sounds of the battle for his home. He emerged now, blinking in the harsh sunlight, his small face pale, his eyes wide with a fear that was older than his years. He saw the bodies of the dead men. He saw the blood. And then he saw his father, lying so terribly still in Lily's arms. "Father," he whispered, the word a small, fragile question in the vast, silent battlefield. The sound of his voice, the sight of his small, terrified face, was a jolt to Lily's soul. It was a reminder. Her fight was not over. Her promise was not yet fulfilled. She had a new vow to keep now, a vow made not to Jed, but to his memory. She had to take care of his son. A new strength, born not of rage but of a fierce, maternal love, flooded through her. She was not just a survivor anymore. She was a guardian. She gently laid Jed's head down and rose to her feet. "Stay there, Caleb," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. "Don't look. It's all right. Everything is going to be all right." She went to the boy and knelt before him, taking his small, trembling hands in hers. "Your father is a hero," she said, her voice thick with tears, but firm. "He was brave, and he was strong. And now, we have to be brave and strong too, for him. Can you do that for me?" He looked at her, his blue eyes swimming with a grief that mirrored her own, and he nodded, a small, silent promise passing between them. The hours that followed were a grim, surreal nightmare. Driven by a will she didn't know she possessed, Lily became the stoic, capable mistress of the ranch once more. She confirmed that Jed was truly gone, a final, heartbreaking act of closure. Then, she dealt with the aftermath. 2 of Cain's men were still alive, wounded but not fatally. She disarmed them, bound their hands, and, with a cold, dispassionate mercy, treated their wounds as best she could. They were no longer monsters. They were just broken, defeated men. With Caleb's small, solemn help, she brought water to them. "My husband is dead because of you," she told them, her voice devoid of heat, a simple statement of fact. "When you are well enough to ride, you will take your dead and you will leave this valley. And you will tell everyone you meet that this is a place of peace, but that anyone who comes here with violence in their hearts will find only their own grave. Am I understood?" The men, their arrogance shattered, could only nod in shame-faced agreement. Her final, most difficult task was to care for Jed. She and Caleb washed him, cleaning the blood and the dust of the battle from his still, peaceful face. They wrapped him in his finest blanket. They would bury him tomorrow, on the small rise overlooking the valley, next to the graves of his first wife and child. He would be home, with his family. That night, Lily and Caleb sat by the fire, 2 small, lonely islands of grief in the vast, silent house. Caleb, who had been so stoic all day, finally broke, his small body racked with sobs. Lily held him, rocking him gently, her own silent tears soaking his hair. They were all that was left. A woman with a branded back and a boy with a broken heart, the unlikely, shattered remnants of a family. The next morning, they buried him. Lily said the words, simple and from the heart, a farewell to the good, quiet man who had saved her life and had shown her how to love. As she stood by the fresh grave, the weight of the future, of running this ranch alone, of raising this boy alone, pressed down on her. It was a terrifying, impossible task. As if in answer to her unspoken fear, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was Tom, the rancher from Absolution, and a half-dozen other men. They had come, he explained, because the 2 surviving gunmen had ridden into town, their story of the battle, of Jed's death and Lily's impossible stand, spreading like wildfire. They had come not as a posse, but as neighbors, their faces grim with a respect and a sorrow that was genuine. "We came to help, ma'am," Tom said, his hat in his hands, "with the burying, and with whatever comes next." And so, the community that had once cast her out now came to embrace her. The men helped her repair the damage to the ranch. Their wives came, bringing food and offering comfort. They no longer saw a savage or a witch. They saw a grieving widow and a brave boy. They saw one of their own. In the weeks and months that followed, Lily, with the help of her new neighbors and the steady, quiet presence of Caleb, began to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. She learned to run the ranch, her mind as sharp and as capable as any man's. The brand was still on her back, a permanent, puckered scar. But it was no longer a mark of shame. It was a battle scar, a testament to the monster she had defeated and the man she had loved. One cool autumn evening, months later, she and Caleb were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. "Do you miss him?" Caleb asked, his voice a small, quiet thing in the twilight. "Every day," Lily replied, her voice soft. "But he's not gone, Caleb. He's right here." She placed a hand on his chest, over his heart. "And here," She placed a hand on her own. He's a part of us. He's in the way you stand, so tall and strong. He's in the way the sun warms the land he loved. He's in every good and brave and honorable thing we do. She was no longer the gilded lily. She was Lily Stone, the owner of the Stone Ranch, a woman of quiet strength and deep scars, a mother to a fine, strong boy. She had been branded, broken, and left for dead. But she had survived. She had loved. And she had won. She had cried that she was dirty, inside and out. But as she sat there, a free woman in her own home, with the love of a good boy and the respect of a community, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had finally, truly, washed herself clean. The scars of the dawn were a reminder not of what she had lost, but of everything she had fought, and bled, and loved to win.